So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how I redid the interior of this enclosed trailer, which includes painting the walls and the ceiling, adding a non-slip paint to the flooring and the ramp, and then I also installed a couple Etrack brackets and some places to hold ratchet straps and a couple other items. So when I got this trailer, this is what it looked like. This nasty plywood was on the exterior. Now I removed that, added aluminum siding, and since I didn't want to pay for new plywood to do the interior, I did use all that external plywood for the inside. Before putting that plywood on the inside, I did insulate all of the walls to help keep it cooler during the summer, because this trailer does serve as a garage for either my little sand rail or my razor. When I did the insulation, I went ahead and put some up in the ceiling as well, and then just used some 1/4 inch wood in order to cover that and hold that insulation up in place. Then I ended up letting a buddy of mine borrow my trailer, and he ended up punching 2 holes through the floor. Instead of doing a patch job on that floor, I decided just to get some more 3/4 inch plywood and put an extra layer on the floor. The reason I did this is it just adds extra strength, and with the purpose I was using this trailer, it wasn't going to hurt it. So if you are interested in checking out how I did the siding on the trailer or redid the flooring, I will have both of those icons at the end of this one. You can click on to check them out. So I've been using this trailer looking like crap on the inside of it for probably 3 or 4 years now, and I just finally got sick of it to the point where I wanted to do something about it, and that's what we're going to go over in this video. So let's get to it. So because this wood was so beat up, there was a bunch of knots and holes and nasty spots in the wood. I also had a lot of air gaps between some of the steel framing and the actual wood. Same thing with the ceiling. And then the other thing I had, which I had to figure out what to do about, is the ceiling was actually lifting in a couple spots at the front of the trailer, and I had to figure out how to pull that back down and secure it so then I could go ahead and caulk and paint it. There was also a pretty nasty air gap between the walls of the trailer and the ceiling itself. So you'll notice that brown trim material. I actually cut that out of slits of some miscellaneous wood I had and just tacked it up there using a nail gun and some wood glue in order to cover most of that air gap. So all I would have to do after that is go ahead and caulk it in. Now I thought I had actually got footage of me repairing the actual gap between the ceiling at the front of the trailer and the trim, but apparently I didn't, so I'm just going to explain how I did it. I put a couple long screws and screwed those into the 1/4 inch plywood a couple inches back from the trim material at the front of the trailer. Then I used some adhesive that came in a caulking tube in order to put between the 1/4 inch plywood and the trim in the trailer. Usually I buy liquid nails extreme heavy duty. However, this time I decided to try this Loctite brand PL510. After using this product for the first time, I do have to say I prefer the liquid nails over it. Once putting that adhesive between the void between the 1/4 inch plywood and the trim, then I took some tie wire and got some items out of my garage that weighed about 10 to 15 pounds apiece. And using some tie wire, I wrapped the tie wire around the screw in the trailer, then tied that tie wire to those items that I found in my garage. The weight of those items pulled that 1/4 inch plywood right down to the trim. Now some of that wood adhesive did squirt out between those items, and I wiped that off immediately, then let it dry overnight, and then any gaps that were still there I just filled in with caulking the next day. So it has been a couple weeks since I have done that repair, and so far that Loctite adhesive is holding that stuff tight. The rest of the air gaps, I ended up just caulking those in using Alex Painter's caulk. This is the best caulking I've probably ever used as far as interior, exterior, and it's held up really well on all my previous projects, and it is actually rather on the cheap side, which makes it even better. Now I did end up using about 15 tubes of caulking to caulk all the creases and air gaps in this trailer. And one of the main things that helped me with that is my rigid battery operated caulking gun that I actually picked up at a garage sale for 20 bucks. This battery operated caulking gun allows you to set the speed at which it goes, and it gives you a nice consistent bead of caulking instead of having to pull the trigger every couple of seconds. So it made it lay down that caulking very easily, very smoothly, and made it much easier to cover this much surface area using that versus a manual one. Instead of just throwing away that extra caulking after smoothing it out with my finger, I did fill other gaps and holes in that nasty plywood, and that way it made it a much smoother finish when the finished product was done. Once laying that extra caulking in some bad spots in the plywood, I just used a metal scraper in order to smooth it out. And then the residual off of that, I would just take to another bad spot and just continue that until I ran out of that extra caulking. When you are laying caulking down, it is better to start with the less amount than what you think you need. You can always add more, but if you end up adding too much to start, when you're smoothing that bead out with your finger or one of the caulking tools that's made for that, it can make a lot bigger mess than if you start with a smaller amount and you have a couple air gaps in that caulking and you can just add a little bit more and smooth it out again. Now, being as though it's only like my 4th or 5th time using this battery operated caulking gun instead of a manual one, I did end up adding more than I should have in quite a few spots on this trailer. But once again, I didn't really waste it because I used it to fill other gaps in the trailer in the bad spots in the wood. Now, in the ceiling, I did have some pretty big voids between the 1/4 inch plywood the first time I installed it. So to cover that up a little better, I just took some extra strips of that 1/4 inch plywood and put those to cover the big air gaps, so it looks a lot better when the final paint job is done. The other big air gap I had was around the inside of the door frame. Because it was a pretty big air gap, I was thinking about putting some trim around the door frame. However, that caulking was pretty cheap, so I ended up just filling that in with caulking and it came out really well. Now, because this plywood was so old and nasty, I did want to sand it down a little bit before adding the paint to it, just to remove any chips that were coming off of that white paint that had deteriorated so bad. So I used some 40 grit on my orbital sander and just gave everything in the entire surface of the trailer a quick sand. So one of the other main things that kind of triggered me to get this done is we actually were cleaning out the garage and I found that we had about 2.5 gallons left out of a 5-gallon bucket of semi-gloss paint that was light gray that we had left over from painting some of the interior of our house. Now, I don't know how that interior paint is going to hold up because of the extreme temperature changes, because it's in a trailer outdoors. And if I do have any problems with that cracking or anything else, I will do an update video and let you know if that happens. But since I was trying to keep this project as minimal cost as possible, and I had that left over and really no other purpose for it, I decided to give it a try. So my patience isn't really that great for painting, and if I really wanted to get technical, I could have used painter's tape and went around the door frame and some of the other items like the other brackets that I've got installed in there and the air vents. However, I just used a paintbrush to go around those by hand, and if I did get a little bit on the vent, I just wiped it off quickly with a rag. Once doing that, I either used the small roller or a big roller to finish off the bigger areas of the walls in the trailer. I did use the small roller for the majority of the ceiling because it was just a lot lighter once it was loaded with paint, and I just had an easier time maneuvering it around the ceiling. Once the ceiling and the walls were finished, then it was time to do the floor. I used some caulking to fill in the big voids between some of the pieces of plywood on the floor. So I barely had enough paint to finish the walls and the ceiling, so I did have to go buy some paint in order to do the floor. So one of the key things that I wanted when painting the floor is I wanted a textured paint so it had some grip to it and it wasn't very slick. So I ended up getting this Valspar porch, floor, and patio wood or concrete slab paint that already had the texture added to it, so I didn't have to add anything. Now, if I would have had enough leftover paint after doing the wall and the ceilings, I probably would have just thrown a little bit of sand in with my remaining paint and done it that way. But since I ran out, I did have to buy this gallon, and it cost me about 50 bucks. I used a paint mixer on my drill in order to mix up that gallon really well, because most likely whatever texture they used in that paint might settle to the bottom. So I wanted to make sure I spent a good amount of time mixing that up to make sure whatever textured material they used in this paint was thoroughly mixed in the entire gallon before spreading it out. So being as though I was just painting the floor of the trailer, I didn't see there was really a point in dirtying another paint tray. So I just dumped some out on the floor. Then using the paintbrush, I freehanded around the edges. Once getting the edges done, then I went ahead and used the big roller in order to do the majority of the floor. One thing I did realize after getting about half of the floor done in the trailer, that it was very helpful to go with the grain a couple times with the roller and then go cross grain. That helped fill in the imperfections in that plywood a lot faster than just trying to go the same direction several times over it.
That floor paint actually dried pretty quickly, and I was able to go back out there after about 3 or 4 hours, and then I went ahead and used my caulking gun to fill in the air gaps between the walls and the floor. In order to smooth out the caulking after laying the bead, usually I just use my finger. However, these air gaps were pretty big, and I had somehow accumulated this little caulking tool. This is the first time I've really tried using one of those, and for the most part, I actually thought it went pretty well. You'll notice that that was one spot where I actually got too much caulking on the actual bead, and it kind of peeled off the side of the tool, making a little bit of a mess. However, for the most part, it worked really well, and if I would have just noticed it was peeling too much off and cleaned it off and then went back to that spot and did it again, that wouldn't have happened. The biggest key to using one of these tools, I think, is as soon as you lay a bead and smooth that bead out, you need to wipe that tool completely clean with a paper towel before starting another bead, because as that stuff accumulates on the tool, it will start peeling off the side of it, and that's when you end up with the situation I had here.
I've never really had good luck using those tools, but I was actually pretty impressed with this one, and I might try and use it in the future more often. The other thing I wanted to add to this trailer is a couple of aluminum diamond plate pieces to protect the wood on the trailer at the front, because the front tires of my RZR do have to basically touch it every time I come in. So right here I'm just using my density stud finder to find the steel beams behind the wood. If you've never heard of one of these density stud finders, I highly recommend getting one. They're not that expensive, and they work amazing to find studs in the walls in your house, or in this case, a 1-inch piece of square tubing behind a piece of plywood. Now, because I did not buy this aluminum diamond plate new, I got it pretty cheap because it was just scraps. I did have to use a couple pieces per side. So right here, I anchored one screw into the first piece. Then I went ahead and put the other piece next to it to make sure they were going to line up correctly. Then anchored the second screw into that first piece. Took that away, used my stud finder to find the steel beams behind that. Pre-drilled the holes through the steel beam and anchored those. Then followed that same basic concept for the second piece. And did the same for the other side. So right here, I'm speeding my battery-operated caulking gun up because this was a partial tube that I had just put in. So I sped it up in order to get it to where it was starting to squeeze something out. Then I slowed it back down to go ahead and apply that caulking. Now, because these were scrap pieces and they didn't perfectly line up with each other, I did use the Alex painter's caulk to go around those to kind of blend that in so it wasn't as noticeable. Here is the Etrack that I ended up buying off of Amazon. I ended up just getting 10 individual Etrack pieces and then 10 straps to go with it. The reason I bought it this way is getting the full track assemblies can get rather expensive quickly, and I didn't really think I needed an Etrack hookup every inch. By getting this 10-pack, I was able to put 5 of these on each side of the trailer, which I felt gave me plenty of options as far as strapping stuff to the side of my trailer or to the front of the back of the trailer. And worst case scenario, if I need some more, another 10 packs, only another 30 bucks. I anchored these in place with the screws and washers that came with the Etrack, and I put those into the 1-inch square tubing that was behind the plywood in my trailer. When anchoring these, I knew my 1-inch square tubing was right between the seams of the plywood. However, if you weren't 100% sure where those steel beams are in the trailer you have,
You can always use a density stud finder in order to find them. Just take that stud finder, press the button on it, run it across the wall until it starts beeping at you, mark that spot. Then go to the other side and do the same thing and mark that, and usually dead center of those two markings should be the center of that steel stud. When pre-drilling a hole to go into steel, I like to take the drill bit, put it over the top of the screw, and then I should just see the threads of that screw sticking out past the drill bit. If that screw goes in too tight and it doesn't really want to, I can always upsize one, but that usually gives me a nice tight fit on that screw holding in whatever I'm trying to do. And make sure you're using machine screws in order to do this. If you're using wood screws, there's a good chance it's going to snap off in the steel, and that really sucks when that happens. I also added a latch to hold the door in the open position. I just never got around to putting one on. So normally these are located at the bottom of the door. However, I didn't want to have to bend over in order to do it, so I put it about halfway up the door. So here's a final look at the end result, guys. It looks 100 times better than what it did before I started this project. The other real problem we had was that ramp was really slick, and that textured floor paint actually worked really well to give some grip to the floor and that ramp so we don't possibly slip when we're going in and out. I did add a couple extra hooks for some wheel chocks and to hold the Etrack that I just installed along with my straps. If you are interested, there is going to be a couple icons at the end of this video with some previous projects that I've also done to this trailer, including a solar panel install to keep my sand rail or razor charged when it is being stored, along with the siding and a couple others. And that's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.